The hospital bracelets still scratched against my wrist when he cornered me in the funeral home parking lot. His eyes weren't filled with grief like mine. They burned with something else entirely. Something that made my blood run cold even on that sweltering August afternoon in Tennessee. "Now that she's gone," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear, "there's nothing stopping us from having that baby." That wasn't my husband speaking anymore. That was a predator who had been waiting for my mother to die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Good morning, my dear ones. This is Christina Miller, and I'm 74 years old, speaking to you from my small apartment here in Nashville, Tennessee. The magnolia tree outside my window is blooming, just like it did all those years ago when my story began. A story I've kept buried for nearly 4 decades. But today, I need to share it with you, because silence has a way of rotting the soul from the inside out. I was born in 1950, in the hills of eastern Tennessee, in a town called Cookeville that most folks have never heard of. My daddy, Robert Hayes, worked the railroad, and my mama, Dorothy Hayes, was a seamstress who could make magic happen with just a needle and thread. Our house sat on Maple Street, a white clapboard home with green shutters and a wraparound porch where Mama would sit in the evenings, mending clothes for the neighbors to earn extra money. We were 4 children: myself, my older brother James, my younger sister Patricia, and our baby brother Michael. I was the middle girl, sandwiched between James's serious nature and Patricia's wild spirit. Mama always said I was her helper, the one who could calm a crying baby or talk sense into a stubborn teenager. Maybe that's why what happened later hurt so much, because I'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over. Childhood in Cookeville was simple but rich. We didn't have much money, but we had each other. Summer meant catching fireflies in mason jars and listening to Mama's stories on the front porch. Winter meant huddling around the wood stove while Daddy read to us from his collection of adventure books. Mama taught me to sew when I was 8, and by 12, I could hem a dress better than most grown women. School was a one-room building where Mrs. Henderson taught all grades together. I loved learning, especially reading and writing. I dreamed of becoming a teacher someday, maybe even moving to a big city like Memphis or Nashville. But Mama would shake her head when I talked about such things. "Dreams are fine, Ellie," she'd say, "but a woman's greatest calling is to be a wife and mother. That's where real happiness lies." When I turned 16, everything changed. Mama started getting sick. A cough that wouldn't go away, fatigue that kept her in bed most mornings. The doctor in town said it was just the flu, but I could see the worry in Daddy's eyes. Mama kept working, kept sewing, kept taking care of us, but she was fading right before our eyes. Bologna. It was during this time that I met Reggie Miller. He was 22, worked at the textile mill in the next town over, and had the kind of confidence that turned heads when he walked into a room. He had sandy brown hair that he kept perfectly combed, bright blue eyes, and a smile that could charm the birds from the trees. When he started coming around, asking Daddy's permission to court me, I felt like the luckiest girl in Tennessee. Our courtship was proper, as was expected in those days. Reggie would pick me up on Sunday afternoons after church, and we'd walk through downtown Cookeville, sometimes stopping for a soda at Miller's drugstore. He was attentive, bringing me small gifts: wildflowers he'd picked on his way to see me, a small book of poetry, a ribbon for my hair. He treated me like I was something precious, something to be protected and cherished. But even then, there were signs I was too young and too smitten to recognize. The way his jaw would tighten when other young men spoke to me at church socials, how he'd grip my hand a little too tightly when he thought I was paying too much attention to someone else's conversation. The questions he'd ask about where I'd been, who I'd talked to, what I'd discussed. I thought it was romantic, a sign that he cared so much about me he couldn't bear the thought of losing me. Mama's condition worsened as the months went by. What had started as a persistent cough had turned into something much more serious. She'd lost weight, her beautiful auburn hair had started falling out, and there were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of rest seemed to cure. The doctor finally admitted he didn't know what was wrong, suggested we take her to a specialist in Nashville, but we didn't have money for specialists or fancy hospitals. Daddy worked double shifts at the railroad, trying to save up, but medical bills have a way of eating up a family's savings faster than you can blink. I took on more sewing work, staying up late into the night to finish alterations and repairs for the ladies in town. Patricia, who was only 14, started cleaning houses after school. Even little Michael, barely 10 years old, found odd jobs around town, sweeping steps, carrying groceries, anything that would bring in a few extra cents. Thomas saw how hard things were for our family, and that's when he first showed what seemed like his generous nature. He'd bring groceries, saying he'd gotten a good deal at the company store. He'd slip Daddy a few dollars, claiming it was payment for letting him take up so much of my time. He even offered to pay for Mama to see that specialist in Nashville, but Daddy's pride wouldn't let him accept such a large gift from a man who wasn't even family yet. Looking back now, I realized Thomas wasn't being generous. He was investing. He was making himself indispensable to our family, creating a debt of gratitude that would be hard to repay. But at 17, with my mama dying and my family struggling, all I saw was a man who loved me enough to help us in our darkest hour. By the time I turned 18, Mama was bedridden most days. The woman who had once been the center of our household, the one who kept us all organized and loved, had become a shadow of herself. She'd lost so much weight that her wedding ring slipped off her finger. Her voice, once strong enough to call us in from 3 blocks away, had become a whisper. But even in her weakened state, Mama was still sharp as a tack. One afternoon in early spring, when the dogwood trees were just starting to bloom, she called me to her bedside. Her hand, once steady enough to thread the finest needle, trembled as she reached for mine. "Ellie, honey," she said, her voice barely audible. "I need to talk to you about Ridgie." I settled into the chair beside her bed, the same chair where I'd sat countless times over the past months, reading to her, holding her hand, pretending everything was going to be all right. "He's a good man, Mama," I said, assuming she was worried about him asking for my hand in marriage. We'd been courting for almost 2 years, and folks were starting to talk about when he might propose. Mama shook her head slightly, a movement that seemed to take all her strength. "There's something in his eyes, child, something that worries me. The way he looks at you sometimes. It's not love, Ellie, it's ownership." I was young and defensive, sure that Mama's illness was making her see things that weren't there. "He loves me, Mama. He takes care of our family. He's going to take care of me." "That's what I'm afraid of," she whispered, her gray eyes searching mine. "Promise me something, Eleanor. Promise me that if things ever get bad, if he ever hurts you or tries to control you, you'll leave. You'll come to your brother James or your sister, or you'll find a way to get help. Promise me you won't stay just because you think you have to." I promised, thinking it was just the fevered worry of a dying woman who loved me too much to let go. I had no idea that in less than 6 months I'd understand exactly what she'd seen in Ridgie Miller's eyes. I had no idea that her death would unleash something in him that had been carefully hidden behind that charming smile and those thoughtful gestures. 3 weeks after that conversation, on a rainy Tuesday morning in April, Mama drew her last breath. She was 45 years old, and she died holding my hand, whispering my name and telling me she loved me. The last thing she said was, "Remember your promise, Ellie girl." Remember, I thought she was talking about being a good daughter, honoring her memory, taking care of the family. I had no idea she was giving me a lifeline I'd desperately need in the months to come. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The funeral home in Cookeville had never seen so many flowers. It seemed like every family in town had sent arrangements, their way of honoring a woman who had touched so many lives with her kindness and her gifted hands. The scent of lilies and roses was overwhelming, mixing with the smell of the old wooden pews and the mustiness that all funeral homes seem to carry. I sat in the front row, wearing the black dress Mama had made me for my high school graduation just 2 years earlier. It felt wrong, using something she'd sewn with such love and pride for such a sorrowful occasion. Daddy sat beside me, his railroad calloused hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead like he was trying to see through the casket to some distant place where his wife still lived and breathed. James had come home from his job in Knoxville, looking older than his 26 years in his borrowed suit. Patricia, barely 16, kept crying into her handkerchief until it was soaked through. Little Michael, only 12 now, sat perfectly still, his face pale and confused. He kept asking when Mama was coming home, not understanding that she never would. Reggie sat directly behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder in what everyone probably saw as a gesture of comfort. But I could feel the possessiveness in that touch, the way his fingers gripped just a little too tightly, the way he'd lean forward occasionally to whisper in my ear when other young men from town came to pay their respects. "So sorry for your loss, Ellie," Bobby Morrison had said, a boy I'd gone to school with who'd always been sweet on me. He'd taken my hand for just a moment, the way folks do at funerals, and I'd felt Reggie's grip on my shoulder tighten immediately. "Thank you, Bobby," I'd whispered back. But before I could say anything else, Reggie was standing, inserting himself between us. "I'll make sure Ellie gets your condolences," he'd said smoothly, his smile polite but his eyes cold as winter. "She's pretty overwhelmed right now, as you can imagine." Bobby had nodded and moved on, but I'd caught the confused look he'd thrown back at us. Even in my grief, I'd felt a flutter of something. Embarrassment, maybe. Or the first tiny seed of unease. After the service, as we stood around the graveside watching them lower Mama's casket into the red Tennessee clay, I felt like I was watching my childhood being buried right alongside her. She'd been the heart of our family, the one who kept us all connected, who made our little house feel like home. Without her, we were just 5 people who happened to share the same last name and the same devastating loss. The preacher, Reverend Matthews, said all the right words about God's plan and eternal rest, but they felt hollow to me. What kind of plan included taking a 45-year-old mother away from her children? What kind of mercy left a 12-year-old boy asking when his mama was coming home? As the crowd began to disperse, promising to bring casseroles and offering help we all knew we were too proud to accept, Reggie stayed close to my side. Too close. When my school friend Mary Ellen approached to hug me, he stepped forward like a bodyguard. "Ellie's had enough for today," he announced before I could even speak. "I think it's best if she heads home to rest." Mary Ellen looked at me with raised eyebrows, clearly expecting me to correct him, or at least speak for myself. But I was so drained, so empty from crying and trying to hold my family together, that I just nodded. It was easier to let him handle things, easier to lean on his strength when I felt like I might collapse at any moment. That was my first mistake, letting him speak for me when I was too weak to speak for myself. The ride back to the house was quiet, except for the sound of gravel crunching under the wheels of Reggie's truck. He'd driven us to the funeral that morning, insisting that Daddy shouldn't have to worry about transportation on such a difficult day. Another kindness that felt generous at the time, but would later reveal itself as something else entirely. Back at the house, the kitchen table was covered with food brought by neighbors. Fried chicken, green bean casserole, cornbread, 3 different kinds of pie. In the South, food is how we show love, how we try to fill the emptiness left by loss. But none of us had much appetite. "See me tui ak house." Daddy disappeared into his bedroom with a bottle of whiskey that someone had quietly slipped him at the funeral. James sat on the front porch, smoking cigarettes and staring out at the street. Patricia took Michael into the living room and tried to distract him with a radio program, but I could hear her sniffling between the sound of music and laughter from the radio. Reggie appointed himself as my protector, answering the door when more neighbors came by, accepting their food offerings, and politely but firmly turning away visitors who wanted to sit with the family for a while. "Ellie needs her rest," became his constant refrain. "The family needs privacy to grieve." At first, I was grateful. Making small talk with well-meaning neighbors was the last thing I wanted to do. But as the afternoon wore on, I started to feel isolated, cut off from the community support that usually surrounded a grieving family. When Mrs. Patterson from down the street came by with her famous chocolate cake and asked if she could sit with me for a while, I actually wanted the company. But Reggie had already thanked her and sent her on her way before I could even make it to the door. "She means well," he said when I asked about it later. "But you don't need a bunch of gossipy old women filling your head with their chatter right now. You need peace and quiet." That evening, after the last casserole had been delivered and the house had finally quieted down, Reggie and I sat on the front porch swing where Mama used to do her mending. The spring air was warm and sweet with the smell of honeysuckle, and for a moment, I could almost pretend she might come out the front door at any minute, wiping her hands on her apron and asking if we wanted some sweet tea. "I've been thinking," Reggie said, his arm around my shoulders, pulling me close against his side. "About us, about our future." I wasn't ready to think about the future. The present was hard enough to bear. But he kept talking, his voice low and serious in the gathering dusk. "Your mama's gone now, and your daddy, well, he's not handling this well. James has his own life in Knoxville, and Patricia's just a kid. Someone needs to take care of you, Ellie. Someone needs to make sure you're protected and provided for." "I can take care of myself," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure they were true. I'd never lived anywhere but this house, never had a job except helping with Mama's sewing. The thought of being on my own in the world was terrifying. "Of course you can," he said, but there was something condescending in his tone. "But you shouldn't have to. That's what a husband is for. To take care of his wife, to make sure she never has to worry about anything." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Even in the dim light from the porch lamp, I could see it clearly. My heart started racing, not with excitement, but with a kind of panic I couldn't quite name. "Reggie, It's too soon. Mama just—" "I know it seems fast," he interrupted, opening the box to reveal a small diamond ring. "But life is short, Ellie. Your mama's death proves that. We can't waste time waiting for the perfect moment because it might never come." The ring caught the light, sparkling like a tiny star. It was beautiful, probably more expensive than anything my family had ever owned. But something about the timing felt wrong, like he'd been waiting for this moment, for my mother's death to remove the last obstacle between him and what he wanted. "I love you," he continued, taking my left hand and sliding the ring onto my finger without waiting for an answer. "I've loved you since the first moment I saw you at church 2 years ago. I want to marry you, Ellie. I want to take care of you and give you a good life." The ring felt heavy on my finger, heavier than such a small thing should have felt. I looked down at it, then up at Reggie's face, earnest and hopeful in the porch light. He was handsome, successful for a young man his age, kind to my family. Every girl in Cookville would have envied me in that moment. So why did I feel like I was being trapped instead of treasured? "I don't know," I whispered. "Everything's happened so fast and I'm still—" His face changed then, just for a split second. The loving expression flickered and something cold flashed behind his eyes before the warmth returned. But I'd seen it, that momentary glimpse of something that made my stomach clench with unease. "Of course you're upset," he said, his voice gentle again. "You've been through so much today. But think about it, sweetheart. Think about what your mama would have wanted for you. She'd want you to be happy, to be secure. She'd want to know that someone was going to love you and take care of you the way you deserve." He was right about that. Mama had always worried about my future, about what would happen to me if something happened to her and Daddy. She'd have been relieved to know I had someone who wanted to marry me, someone with steady work and good prospects. But I also remembered her last warning, the concern in her gray eyes when she'd talked about the look in Reggie's eyes. Had she seen something I was still too naive to recognize? "Will you at least think about it?" he asked, his thumb stroking over the ring he'd already placed on my finger. "Will you consider becoming my wife?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to speak. The weight of grief, of sudden responsibility, of this unexpected proposal, was crushing down on me like a mountain. I felt 16 again, lost and scared and desperate for someone stronger to tell me what to do. "Good," he said, kissing the top of my head. "That's my good girl. You think about it, and we'll talk more tomorrow." As he drove away that night, I sat on the porch swing and twisted the ring around my finger. It was beautiful, and it represented security, love, a future that wouldn't require me to figure out how to support myself or worry about ending up an old maid. But deep down, in a place I wasn't ready to acknowledge yet, I knew that Mama would not have approved of this timing. She would have wanted me to wait, to grieve properly, to make such an important decision with a clear head and an unburdened heart. The trouble was, grief had made me weak, and weakness had made me vulnerable. And Reggie Miller, I was beginning to realize, was the kind of man who knew exactly how to take advantage of a vulnerable woman. I just didn't understand yet how dangerous that combination would prove to be. Hemeliant man fiti. The engagement lasted exactly 6 weeks. 6 weeks from the day Mama was buried to the day I walked down the aisle of Cookville Baptist Church, wearing a dress I'd sewn myself in a desperate rush because Ridgie insisted we couldn't wait any longer. Why postpone happiness, he'd say whenever I suggested we wait until fall, maybe give ourselves time to properly plan. Your mama wouldn't want you sitting around this sad house dwelling on loss. She'd want you to start your new life, to move forward. He had an answer for every hesitation, a reason for every rushed decision. When I mentioned that 6 weeks seemed awfully fast, he reminded me that people in wartime got married after knowing each other for days. When I worried about what the neighbors would think, he said that anyone who truly cared about us would be happy for our happiness. When I suggested we save money for a proper reception, he said he'd rather spend his money on our future home than on one party that would be forgotten by next week. Always logical, always reasonable, always making me feel foolish for my concerns. The truth was, our little house had become a place of suffocating sadness. Daddy barely came out of his room except to go to work, and when he did emerge, he carried that bottle with him more often than not. James had returned to Knoxville after staying just 3 days past the funeral. Patricia was trying to hold everything together, but she was only 16, barely more than a child herself. And poor Michael was acting out at school, getting into fights, coming home with bloody noses and torn clothes, because he didn't know how else to deal with the rage and confusion of losing the most important person in his world. So when Ridgie painted a picture of a cozy little house across town where we could start fresh, where I could have my own kitchen and my own garden, where we could build something beautiful together, it sounded like salvation. It sounded like escape from the grief that seemed to cling to every corner of Maple Street. The wedding was small, just immediate family and a few close friends. I wore a pale blue dress instead of white, thinking it more appropriate so soon after Mama's death. Ridgie wore his best suit, the same one he'd worn to court me for 2 years, and his smile was so bright it could have powered the church lights. Mrs. Patterson played the organ, the same hymns she'd played for a dozen weddings that year. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony, though I caught him glancing at me with concern more than once during the brief service. Even the preacher seemed to think we were rushing into something that should have been given more time and thought. Daddy walked me down the aisle, but his steps were unsteady and I could smell the whiskey on his breath even through the Old Spice he'd splashed on that morning. He kissed my cheek before handing me over to Ridgie, and I saw tears in his eyes. Whether from grief or drink or worry about his daughter, I couldn't tell. "Take care of her," he mumbled to Ridgie, his voice thick with emotion. "I will, sir," Ridgie replied, his tone formal and respectful. "I'll always take care of her." The reception was held in the church fellowship hall. Patricia had made a simple cake. Mrs. Henderson had provided punch, and a few of the ladies had put together some finger sandwiches. It was modest but sweet, and for a few hours, I almost felt like a real bride instead of a girl running away from her problems. But even on my wedding day, there were signs I should have paid attention to. When my friend Mary Ellen asked if she could help me with anything as a new bride, Ridgie answered before I could open my mouth. "Ellie's got everything she needs," he said, his arm around my waist feeling more like a restraint than an embrace. "I'll be taking care of her from now on." When Bobby Morrison approached to congratulate us and maybe share a dance, Ridgie declined on my behalf, saying I was too tired and overwhelmed for dancing. When Patricia suggested I might want to keep some of Mama's sewing things for my new home, Ridgie said we didn't have room for old furniture and supplies. We'd be making a fresh start with everything new. By evening, I was Mrs. Ridgie Miller, living in a white frame house on Cedar Street, 3 miles away from everything and everyone I'd ever known. The house was indeed cozy. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with modern appliances, a living room with store-bought furniture instead of the hand-me-downs I'd grown up with. Ridgie had prepared it like a nest, everything perfect and in its place. "This is our home now," he said, carrying me over the threshold like newlyweds were supposed to do. "Our sanctuary. Just you and me starting our life together." The first few days felt like playing house. Ridgie would leave for work at the textile mill each morning, kissing me goodbye and telling me to make myself at home, to arrange things however I liked. I spent my time learning the quirks of the stove, figuring out how the wringer washer worked, setting up a small sewing area in the spare bedroom where I could do alterations for extra money. But by the end of the first week, the isolation began to feel oppressive. Cedar Street was on the outskirts of town, with no near neighbors and no easy way to walk to the stores or to visit family. I didn't drive. Few women in Cookville did in those days, so I was dependent on Ridgie for transportation anywhere beyond walking distance. I thought I might visit Patricia tomorrow, I mentioned one evening as we sat down to the pot roast I'd spent all afternoon preparing. See how she's managing with Daddy and Michael. Ridgie looked up from his plate, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. What for? You just saw them at church on Sunday. That was 3 days ago, and Patricia looked exhausted. She's trying to cook and clean and take care of Michael, and Daddy's not. I trailed off, not wanting to speak ill of my father's drinking, even to my husband. Patricia's 16, Ridgie said, his tone becoming firm. She's old enough to handle household responsibilities. It's good for her. Builds character. And your father is a grown man who needs to learn to manage his own grief instead of drowning it in a bottle. His bluntness about Daddy's drinking shocked me. It was true, but it felt cruel to state it so baldly. I just thought I could help, I said quietly. You have your own household to think about now, he replied, reaching across the table to cover my hand with his. Your own husband to take care of. That's where your focus should be, Ellie. That's your responsibility now. I nodded, feeling chastened and confused. Was I being selfish, wanting to help my family? Was it wrong to worry about Patricia trying to fill Mama's shoes when she was still just a child herself? The pattern established itself quickly. Ridgie would leave for work early, giving me a list of tasks for the day, laundry to be done, meals to be planned, household chores to complete. When he came home, he expected a hot supper on the table, a clean house, and my full attention on his day at the mill. Any mention of visiting family or having visitors was met with gentle but firm discouragement. We need this time to adjust to being married, he'd explain. We need to establish our own routines before we start involving other people in our business. When I suggested getting a job to help with expenses, maybe working at the dress shop downtown or taking in more sewing, he was horrified. What kind of husband would I be if I let my wife work outside the home? He demanded. What would people think? That I can't provide for my own family? It's not about that, I tried to explain. I just like staying busy, feeling useful. You are useful, he interrupted. You're useful here, taking care of our home, taking care of me. That's the most important job any woman can have. His words sounded loving, but they felt like cage bars closing around me. I was 18 years old, used to helping Mama with her sewing business, used to contributing to my family's welfare. The idea of spending my days alone in that house, with no purpose beyond keeping it clean and having dinner ready, made me feel restless and trapped. But whenever I tried to express these feelings, Ridgie had a way of making me feel ungrateful, selfish, like I was failing as a wife before I'd even learned how to be one. Most women would be thrilled to have a husband who wants to take care of them, he'd say with that patient tone that made me feel like a spoiled child. Most women would appreciate not having to worry about money or work or any of the burdens that men are supposed to carry. The worst part was that he wasn't wrong exactly. Most women in Cookville would have envied my position. A nice house, a husband with steady work, no financial worries. I should have been grateful. I should have been happy. So why did I feel like I was disappearing a little more each day? The first real argument came 6 weeks after our wedding. I'd walked to town, a 3-mile trek each way, to visit Patricia and check on the family. What I found broke my heart. Daddy was at work, but the house was a mess. Patricia was trying to do laundry in the old wringer washer, while Michael sat at the kitchen table, his homework spread out in front of him, tears streaming down his face as he struggled with arithmetic problems that Mama used to help him with. I don't understand any of this, he was saying, his voice thick with frustration and grief. Mama always helped me with the hard parts. I spent the afternoon helping Michael with his homework, showing Patricia how to get grass stains out of his school clothes, and making a proper supper for when Daddy came home. By the time I walked back to Cedar Street, it was nearly dark, and I was exhausted but felt useful for the first time in weeks. Ridgie was waiting on the front porch, his face dark with anger. Where the hell have you been? He demanded, before I'd even reached the steps. I'd never heard him use that tone before, never heard him curse in my presence. It stopped me cold, made my heart start racing with an instinctive fear. "I went to visit Patricia," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I told you I was worried about—" "You told me you might visit," he corrected, standing up from the porch chair. "You didn't tell me you were planning to spend the entire day there." I came home to an empty house. No supper, no explanation, no idea where my wife had disappeared to. "I lost track of time," I said, climbing the steps slowly. Michael needed help with his schoolwork, and Patricia was struggling with— "I don't give a damn what Patricia was struggling with," he snapped, grabbing my arm as I reached the top step. "Your place is here, with me, not playing nursemaid to a family that needs to learn to take care of itself." His grip on my arm was tight enough to hurt, tight enough to leave marks that would still be visible the next morning. I looked into his eyes and saw something that made my blood run cold, the same possessive fury that Mama had warned me about, the ownership she'd seen and tried to make me understand. "You're hurting me," I whispered. He looked down at his hand wrapped around my arm and released me immediately, his expression shifting from anger to what looked like genuine remorse. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice returning to its normal gentle tone. "I was just worried about you, walking all that way by yourself. Anything could have happened. I love you too much to lose you, Ellie." But as he held me, apologizing and stroking my hair, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. For the first time since Mama's death, my head was clear enough to recognize what was happening. Apologize I wasn't being protected, apologize I was being controlled. And it was only going to get worse. The bruise on my arm took 2 weeks to fade completely. During that time, Reggie was the picture of a devoted husband, bringing me wildflowers, helping with the dishes, even surprising me with a new dress from the department store in the next town. He apologized so many times I lost count, promising it would never happen again, explaining how worry had made him lose his temper. "You're the most precious thing in my life," he'd say, kissing the yellowing marks on my arm. "I can't bear the thought of anything happening to you. That's why I got so upset." Pure fear, nothing else. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. The alternative, that I'd married a man who would hurt me when I didn't obey his wishes, was too terrifying to accept. So I told myself it was an isolated incident, a moment of panic from a new husband who loved me too much for his own good. But the rules began to multiply like weeds after a spring rain. I was no longer allowed to walk to town alone. Too dangerous, he said, for a young woman to be wandering country roads where anything might happen. If I needed something from the store, I should make a list and he'd pick it up after work. If I wanted to visit family, he needed advance notice so he could drive me there and back. Mouse. The telephone we'd had installed became another source of control. When it rang, Reggie expected me to let him answer if he was home. If I answered, he'd hover nearby, listening to every word. Conversations with Patricia became stilted and brief, with me constantly aware of his presence, his silent monitoring of what I said and how long I talked. "It's just good manners," he explained when I asked about it. "I'm the head of this household. People should speak to me first. Then I can pass messages along to you if they're appropriate." Appropriate. The words started showing up in more and more of his explanations. It wasn't appropriate for me to discuss our private business with my family. It wasn't appropriate for me to accept invitations to church socials without checking with him first. It wasn't appropriate for me to spend money, even on household necessities, without his permission. The allowance system started 3 months after our wedding. Instead of giving me access to his paycheck to manage household expenses, the way most married couples operated, Reggie began doling out exact amounts for specific purchases. "This is for groceries this week," he'd say, counting out bills onto the kitchen table. "This is for soap and cleaning supplies. This is for any personal items you might need." The amounts were calculated precisely, leaving no room for impulse purchases or small luxuries. If I ran short, I had to ask for more money and explain exactly why the budgeted amount hadn't been sufficient. It was humiliating, like being a child asking for an allowance from a stern parent. But the worst part was watching what happened to my family while I sat trapped in my pretty little house on Cedar Street. Patricia was trying to hold everything together, but she was still just a 16-year-old girl carrying a woman's responsibilities. When I finally convinced Reggie to drive me for a visit in October, 6 weeks after my last one, I found her thin and exhausted, dark circles under her eyes that reminded me painfully of Mama's final months. "Daddy's been staying out later," she confided when Ridgie stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. "Sometimes he doesn't come home until after midnight, and when he does, he's—" She didn't finish the sentence, but I could see the fear in her young face. Michael had gotten into trouble at school again, this time for stealing lunch money from younger children. When the principal called the house, there was no one home to take the call. When he tried to reach Daddy at work, he was told that Robert Hayes had been missing shifts and might be facing termination if his attendance didn't improve. "I don't know what to do, Ellie," Patricia whispered, tears finally spilling over. "I'm trying to keep house and cook and get Michael to school, but I'm so tired all the time. And Daddy, he's getting worse instead of better." I wanted to help. Every instinct I had screamed at me to pack a bag and move back home, to take care of my family the way Mama would have wanted. But when I mentioned it to Ridgie on the drive home, his reaction was swift and final. "Absolutely not," he said, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. "You're not going back to that mess. You have your own life now, your own responsibilities." "But Patricia is just a child," I protested. "She can't handle all this alone." "Then maybe it's time for your father to step up and be a parent instead of a drunk," he snapped. "Maybe it's time for James to come home from Knoxville and take responsibility for his family instead of leaving it all to a teenage girl." His words stung because they contained grains of truth. Daddy was drinking too much, and James was building his own life 2 hours away. But that didn't mean we should abandon Patricia and Michael to fend for themselves. "I could just help during the day," I suggested carefully. "Come back here every evening, but spend my days making sure the house is running properly, helping Michael with his schoolwork." The truck swerved slightly as Riggie's attention snapped to me. For a moment, I thought he might pull over and— What? Hit me again? The possibility sent ice through my veins. "Let me make something very clear," he said, his voice deadly calm. "You are my wife. Your loyalty is to me, not to the family you left behind when you married me. If you can't understand that, then maybe we need to have a serious conversation about what it means to be married." The threat hung in the air between us like smoke. I understood perfectly what he meant, that my marriage, my security, my entire future depended on my complete compliance with his wishes. That any attempt to maintain meaningful relationships with my family would be seen as betrayal. I turned to look out the passenger window, watching the Tennessee countryside roll past, and felt something die inside me. It wasn't love that had been withering for months. It was hope. Hope that I could find a way to be a good wife while still being a good sister and daughter. Hope that Ridgie would understand that cutting me off from my family was cruel and unnecessary. Hope that the man I'd married bore any resemblance to the man who was now dictating the terms of my existence. That night, lying in bed beside him while he slept, I stared at the ceiling and faced the truth I'd been avoiding for months. Mama had been right. The ownership she'd seen in his eyes had been real, and now it was consuming my life piece by piece. The physical changes started in November. I'd always been slender, but the stress and isolation were taking their toll. I was losing weight despite having access to good food, and my monthly cycles had become irregular. Dark circles appeared under my eyes, matching the ones I'd seen on Patricia's face. When I mentioned feeling unwell, Riggie's response was immediate and alarming. "Maybe you're pregnant," he said, and the hope in his voice was so intense it made my stomach clench. "Maybe God is blessing us with a child." The thought terrified me. A baby would make escape impossible, would bind me to this man and this life forever. But as days passed and my symptoms persisted, I began to fear that his hope might be reality. The home test I finally worked up the courage to buy, walking to the pharmacy in town while Ridgie was at work, spending precious grocery money, and hiding the evidence like a criminal, came back negative. I felt relief so profound, I actually cried, sitting alone on the bathroom floor. But when I told Ridgie the result, his reaction revealed a side of him I'd never seen before. His face went through a series of expressions: disappointment, frustration, and then something calculating that made my skin crawl. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with those cold blue eyes that had once seemed so charming. "Well," he finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "I guess we'll just have to try harder." That night, for the first time in our marriage, I said no. "I'm not feeling well," I explained, turning away from him in our bed. "Maybe in a few days, when I'm feeling stronger." But Reggie had already decided that my feelings, my comfort, my consent were secondary to his desires. What happened next broke something in me that would never fully heal. Afterward, as I lay crying silently while he slept beside me, I understood with crystal clarity what my life had become. I wasn't a wife, I was property. I wasn't a partner, I was a vessel for his ambitions and desires. And somewhere in the darkness of that night, a terrible thought began to form. If I couldn't leave, if I couldn't resist, if I was truly trapped in this nightmare marriage, then maybe my only choice was to find a way to make him want to let me go. The idea that would eventually save my life was born in that moment of complete despair. But first, I would have to survive what was coming next. Because Reggie Miller had decided he wanted a child, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to get one, whether I was willing or not. Winter came early to Tennessee that year, and with it, a coldness in our house that had nothing to do with the weather. Reggie's obsession with having a child had transformed him into someone I no longer recognized, or perhaps it had simply stripped away the mask he'd worn during our courtship, revealing the man he'd always been underneath. The calendar on the kitchen wall became his tool of surveillance. He marked my cycles with red X's, tracking my body like a farmer monitors his livestock for breeding. When my monthly time came and went, he'd watch me with hawk-like intensity, searching for any sign that this might be the month his plans came to fruition. "You need to see a doctor," he announced one December morning, his voice carrying the authority he'd begun using for all our conversations. "There might be something wrong with you." The accusation hit like a slap. Something wrong with me. As if my failure to immediately conceive was a personal defect, a malfunction that needed fixing. "It's only been a few months," I said quietly, not looking up from the biscuits I was cutting for breakfast. "These things take time." "My mother had 4 children in 5 years, he countered, as if this somehow reflected poorly on my worth as a woman. "Healthy women don't have trouble conceiving." I wanted to point out that his mother had also died in childbirth with the 5th baby, but I'd learned that contradicting Reggie led to consequences I wasn't prepared to face. Instead, I focused on the mundane task of getting breakfast on the table, trying to make myself invisible until his mood shifted. But invisibility was becoming harder to achieve. Since that awful night in November, he'd been watching me constantly, monitoring my every move with the intensity of a prison guard. If I took too long in the bathroom, he'd knock on the door, asking what I was doing. If I seemed quieter than usual, he'd demand to know what I was thinking about. If I showed any signs of illness, even a simple headache, he'd hover over me with questions about whether it might be morning sickness. The isolation had become complete. My last visit to see Patricia had been in October, nearly 3 months ago. When I'd asked about going for Christmas, Reggie had flatly refused. "We're starting our own traditions now," he'd said. "Besides, I don't want you getting upset seeing how your father's let everything fall apart. Stress isn't good for conception." Everything in my life was now measured against its potential impact on my ability to produce a child. The food I ate, the activities I did, the emotions I was allowed to feel, all filtered through Reggie's determination to make me pregnant, whether I wanted to be or not. Christmas morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly. Reggie had bought me gifts, a new dress in a style I didn't like, expensive perfume that made me sneeze, and a book about motherhood that felt more like an instruction manual than a present. I'd sewn him shirts and knitted him a sweater, pouring my frustration into needle and thread because it was the only outlet I had left. "I have one more surprise," he said after we'd opened everything else. His smile had that calculating edge I'd learned to dread. "I've made an appointment for you with Dr. Harrison next week. He's going to examine you, make sure everything's working the way it should." The thought of being poked and prodded by a doctor, of having my most private functions discussed and evaluated, made me feel sick. But I also felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Dr. Harrison was old-fashioned but kind, and he'd been delivering babies in Cookeville for 30 years. Maybe if I could speak to him alone, maybe if I could find a way to explain what was happening. "I don't think that's necessary," I said carefully. "I'm young and healthy. These things just take time." Reggie's expression hardened. I've already made the appointment. You'll go, and you'll do whatever he recommends. This isn't a discussion. The finality in his voice told me that arguing would only make things worse. But as I nodded my agreement, I was already planning what I might say to Dr. Harrison, if I could get even a moment alone with him. New Year's Eve found me standing at the kitchen window, watching snow fall on the empty streets of our neighborhood. Most families were either gathered around their radios listening to celebrations from New York City, or attending the watch night service at church. But Reggie had decided we should stay home, just the two of us, focusing on our future. He'd been drinking, something that had become more frequent as his frustration with my failure to conceive grew. Not the falling down drunk that my father had become, but a controlled, calculated drinking that made him meaner and more unpredictable. 1953, he said, raising his glass of whiskey in a mock toast. This is going to be our year, Ellie, the year we finally get what we want. I forced a smile and raised my own glass of sweet tea, but inside I was counting days. The appointment with Dr. Harrison was in 3 days. 3 days to figure out how to communicate my desperation without endangering myself further. Anad apasoi mabailai. The morning of the appointment arrived cold and bright. Reggie drove me to the doctor's office, his mood cheerful in a way that made my skin crawl. Remember, he said as we sat in the waiting room, be completely honest with the doctor. Tell him about your cycles, your symptoms, everything. Don't leave anything out. When my name was called, Reggie started to stand up with me. Sir, the nurse said firmly, the doctor prefers to examine his female patients privately. You can wait here. For a moment, I thought Reggie might argue. His jaw tightened, and his eyes flashed with that familiar anger. But Dr. Harrison's reputation in the community was unassailable, and even Reggie couldn't challenge such a well-established protocol without looking like a fool. I'll be right here, he said to me, his tone carrying a clear warning. Don't forget what we discussed. The examination room felt like a sanctuary. Dr. Harrison was a man in his 60s, with gentle hands and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He delivered half the babies in Cookville, including my brother Michael, and he had a reputation for discretion and compassion. Now then, Mrs. Miller, he said, settling into his chair with my chart. Your husband tells me you've been having trouble conceiving. How long have you been trying? The question was routine, but something in his tone, a careful neutrality, made me look at him more closely. His expression was professional, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he saw more than most people gave him credit for. Baji, about 6 months, I said quietly. And you've been married how long? 8 months. He made a note, then looked up at me again. That's really not very long, my dear. Many perfectly healthy couples take a year or more. There's usually no cause for concern at this stage. I nodded, but didn't trust myself to speak. The kindness in his voice was threatening to crack the careful control I'd maintained for months. Are you having regular cycles? He asked. They've been irregular lately. Any particular stress in your life? Changes in your living situation? Family difficulties? Anything like that? The question was asked casually, but I caught the way he was watching my face. This was my chance. Maybe my only chance. Doctor, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. If someone wanted to prevent pregnancy, what would they do? He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying me with new intensity. Well, he said carefully, there are several methods, though they're not always reliable. May I ask why you're curious about such things? I couldn't meet his eyes. I wondered. For a friend. Dr. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was even gentler than before. Mrs. Miller, in my 40 years of practice, I've learned that when a young woman asks hypothetical questions about preventing pregnancy, they're rarely hypothetical. And when a husband insists on accompanying his wife to such appointments, there's often more to the story than meets the eye. Tears started flowing before I could stop them. Once they started, I couldn't make them stop. Months of fear and isolation and helplessness came pouring out in great, gasping sobs that shook my whole body. Dr. Harrison handed me his handkerchief and waited patiently for the storm to pass. When I finally quieted, he spoke again. Would you like to tell me what's really going on? And so I did. In whispered, broken sentences, I told him about the control, the isolation, the threats. I told him about the calendar on the wall, and the way Ridgie monitored my body like it belonged to him. I told him about the nights when no wasn't an option, and the constant pressure to produce a child I didn't want to bring into such a situation. Dr. Harrison listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions for clarification. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking. "What you're describing," he finally said, "is not a loving marriage. It's not even a normal marriage. What you're describing is systematic abuse." Hearing someone else name it, someone with authority and respectability, was both terrifying and liberating. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. What was happening to me had a name, and it wasn't normal. "I can't leave him," I whispered. "I have nowhere to go, no money, no way to support myself." "There are always options," Dr. Harrison said firmly. "They may not be easy options, but they exist. The question is whether you're ready to consider them." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small brown bottle. "These are for irregularities in the monthly cycle," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Take one every morning with your breakfast. They should help regulate things." I understood. Birth control pills were new and controversial, not commonly prescribed in small towns like Cookville. But Dr. Harrison was giving me control over my own body, perhaps for the first time since my wedding day. "What do I tell my husband?" I asked. "Tell him I'm treating your irregular cycles to improve your chances of conception," he said. "It's not technically a lie. Proper cycle regulation is important for fertility. He doesn't need to know the full purpose of the medication." I tucked the bottle into my purse like it was made of gold. For the first time in months, I felt like I might have some small measure of control over my own fate. "Mrs. Miller," Dr. Harrison said as I prepared to leave, "if you ever need to talk, or if your situation becomes dangerous, please don't hesitate to contact me. And remember, you deserve better than what you're enduring. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." When I returned to the waiting room, Ridgie immediately stood up, his eyes searching my face for information. "Well?" he demanded as we walked to the car. "He gave me some medication," I said, keeping my voice steady, "to regulate my cycles and improve our chances." Riggie's smile was triumphant. "I told you it was a good idea to see him. How long before we should expect results?" "He said it could take several months to see improvement," I replied, the lie coming easily now that I knew what was at stake. As we drove home, I felt the small bottle in my purse like a secret weapon. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time since my wedding day, something felt like enough to build hope on. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to discover that hope, even the smallest amount, can be the most dangerous thing in the world when you're married to a man like Ridgie Miller. Taking those pills every morning became my daily act of rebellion. I'd wake up before Ridgie, slip into the bathroom, and swallow that tiny piece of freedom with a sip of water from the faucet. Then I'd hide the bottle behind the box of Epsom salts under the sink, wrapped in an old washcloth where he'd never think to look. For 3 months, my secret worked perfectly. I told Ridgie that Dr. Harrison said the medication needed time to regulate my system, that we should expect to see results by spring. Meanwhile, my cycles became predictable for the first time since our wedding, and I felt like I had reclaimed some small piece of myself. But living a double life takes a toll that I hadn't anticipated. The constant vigilance, the careful monitoring of every word and expression, the fear that one slip would expose everything, it was exhausting. I started having nightmares about Ridgie finding the pills, about him discovering that I was actively preventing the pregnancy he wanted so desperately. The stress began showing in ways I couldn't hide. I lost more weight, developed a nervous habit of touching my throat when I lied, and found myself jumping at every unexpected sound. Ridgie noticed, of course. He noticed everything. "You seem anxious lately," he observed one evening in March, watching me over the dinner table with those calculating blue eyes. "Is there something you're not telling me?" "Just tired," I replied, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Dr. Harrison said the medication might make me feel run down for a while." It wasn't entirely a lie. I was exhausted, just not for the reasons I claimed. But Ridgie accepted the explanation, or at least appeared to. I was learning that with him, appearances could be deceiving. Spring brought news that changed everything. Patricia called one afternoon while Reggie was at work, a rare opportunity for us to talk freely, since he'd started requiring me to tell him about every phone call I received. "Ellie," she said, her voice strained with emotion, "I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to get upset." My heart immediately started racing. In our family, conversations that began that way never ended well. "What is it?" I asked, sinking into the kitchen chair. "It's Daddy," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "He's been fired from the railroad. They said his drinking made him unreliable, that he missed too many days. And there's more." I waited, though every instinct told me I didn't want to hear what came next. "He's been borrowing money," Patricia continued, "from people around town, promising to pay them back when things got better. But now some of those people are getting ugly about it. Mr. Coleman came by yesterday and said if Daddy doesn't pay what he owes by the end of the month, he's going to have the sheriff put us out of the house." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Our family home, the place where Mama had sewn countless dresses and raised 4 children, where I'd learned to cook at her elbow and dreamed about my future. We might lose it all because Daddy couldn't stop drinking long enough to keep his job. "How much does he owe?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Near as I can figure, about $200, Patricia said. "Might as well be $2,000 for all the chance we have of getting it." $200. It was more money than our family had ever had at one time, but it wasn't impossible. Reggie made good money at the textile mill, and I knew he had savings put away. If I could just find a way to ask him. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was hopeless. Reggie had made his position on my family crystal clear. He saw them as a burden, a distraction from our marriage, and his plans for our future. The idea of him giving money to help Daddy, a man he openly despised for his drinking, was laughable. "What about James?" I asked desperately. "Have you contacted him in Knoxville?" "I tried," Patricia said. "But his wife answered the phone and said they can't help. They're expecting their first baby and need every penny for medical bills and baby things. She wasn't very kind about it, Ellie. I think she blames us for James not coming around more." I could picture the conversation, could imagine my sister-in-law's cold dismissal of Patricia's plea for help. James had been pulling away from the family since Mama's death, building a new life that didn't include the messy complications of his grieving relatives. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the walls Reggie had painted a cheerful yellow when we'd first moved in. This house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison, and my family, what was left of it, was falling apart while I sat trapped 3 miles away, helpless to do anything. That night, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I would ask Reggie for the money. I would swallow my pride, endure his lectures about my family's failures, accept whatever conditions he wanted to impose. The worst he could do was say no, and if he did, at least I would know I'd tried. Michael Soti. I waited until after dinner, when he was relaxed and reading his newspaper in the living room. I'd made his favorite meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with ham, hoping that good food might put him in a generous mood. "Reggie," I began, settling into the chair across from him, "I need to talk to you about something important." He looked up from his paper, and I saw his expression immediately become guarded. In the months since our marriage, conversations that began with "I need to talk" had rarely gone the way I'd hoped. "What is it?" he asked, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. I told him about Patricia's call, about Daddy losing his job and the money he owed around town. I explained about the threat to put them out of the house, about James being unable to help. I tried to make the case that helping my family would reflect well on Reggie, that people would see him as generous and responsible. Throughout my explanation, his expression grew darker and darker. By the time I finished, his face was stone cold with fury. "Let me make sure I understand," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You want me to give $200, money I've worked for, money I've saved for our future, to bail out your drunk father who can't be bothered to stay sober long enough to keep a job." "It's not just for Daddy," I said quickly. "It's for Patricia and Michael. They're just children, and they'll be homeless if—" "They should have thought about that before they enabled his drinking," Reggie interrupted. "You all should have." Instead of making excuses for him, someone should have forced him to face his problems months ago. "He's grieving," I said, my voice smaller now as I recognized the futility of my appeal. "He loved Mama so much, and losing her is no excuse for destroying his children's lives," Ridgie finished. "And it's certainly no reason for me to throw away our hard-earned money on a lost cause." The finality in his voice told me the conversation was over, but I couldn't give up. Not when Patricia and Michael's future hung in the balance. "Please," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "I'll do anything you want. I'll never ask for anything else. I'll stop complaining about visiting them. You'll what?" he asked, standing up suddenly. "You'll finally start acting like a proper wife instead of a spoiled child? You'll focus on your own household instead of trying to save people who don't want to be saved?" His voice was getting louder, and I could see the familiar anger building in his eyes. But I was desperate enough to push forward despite the warning signs. "I'll give you a baby," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I'll stop taking the medication Dr. Harrison gave me, and we'll have the child you want." The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Riggie's expression shifted from anger to something much more dangerous, a calculating satisfaction that made my blood run cold. "Stop taking the medication?" he repeated slowly. "What exactly do you mean by that?" I tried to backtrack, to explain that I meant I'd stop taking it once we'd helped my family, but the damage was already done. Ridgie was too intelligent, too suspicious, to let such a slip pass without investigation. "Show me," he said simply. "Show you what?" "The medication. Show me what Dr. Harrison prescribed." My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. "It's just pills for irregular cycles. Nothing interesting. Then you won't mind showing them to me." I sat frozen, knowing that any further resistance would only make things worse. With trembling hands, I led him to the bathroom and retrieved the bottle from its hiding place behind the Epsom salts. Ridgie examined the label carefully, his face growing more thunderous with each word he read. When he looked up at me, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me more than his previous anger ever had. "Birth control," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You've been taking birth control pills for 3 months while lying to my face about trying to have a baby." There was no point in denying it now. "Ridgie, please let me explain." "Explain what?" he exploded, grabbing my arm with bruising force. "Explain how my own wife has been deceiving me? Explain how you've been preventing the very thing we've been working toward? Explain how you made a fool of me while pretending to be the innocent little wife who just couldn't seem to conceive?" His grip was so tight I could feel my bones grinding together, but worse than the physical pain was the realization that my secret war was over, and I had lost completely. "The money," I whispered desperately. "What about helping my family?" Riggie's laugh was cruel and humorless. "After this betrayal? After you've proven that you can't be trusted? You must be out of your mind." He released my arm suddenly, and I stumbled backward against the sink. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice returning to that terrifying calm. "You're going to flush these pills down the toilet right now, while I watch. Then you're going to call that meddling doctor and tell him you won't be needing his services anymore. And then we're going to start over with this baby business, except this time, there won't be any lies or deception." I understood what he meant, and the understanding filled me with despair so profound I could barely breathe. He would monitor everything now. Every pill I took, every doctor's visit, every moment of my cycle. My brief taste of autonomy was over, and the consequences would be swift and merciless. As I watched those tiny pills swirl down the drain, I knew that I had lost more than just birth control. I had lost my last hope of maintaining any control over my own body, my own future. But I had also learned something important about Ridgie Miller. When his control was threatened, when his plans were disrupted, he became capable of a cruelty that I was only beginning to understand. And I was about to discover just how far that cruelty could go. The weeks that followed my betrayal's discovery were the darkest of my life. Riggie's surveillance became absolute. He checked my purse before leaving for work, monitored every phone call, and even started coming home unexpectedly during his lunch break to make sure I was where I was supposed to be. The calendar on the kitchen wall became a weapon of psychological warfare. Red marks appeared for days when I was most likely to conceive, circled in thick ink like targets he was determined to hit. He studied my body with the intensity of a scientist, watching for signs, asking intrusive questions, treating me like a breeding animal rather than his wife. But the worst part wasn't his obsessive behavior. It was the complete isolation from my family's crisis. 3 weeks after our confrontation, Patricia called with the news I'd been dreading. "We lost the house," she said, her voice hollow with defeat. "Mr. Coleman came with the sheriff yesterday. We had to pack up whatever we could carry and leave the rest." I gripped the phone receiver so tightly my knuckles went white. "Where are you staying?" "Mrs. Henley said we could sleep in her barn for a few nights, but it's not permanent. Michael's been crying every night, asking when we can go home. I don't know what to tell him." The image of my 12-year-old brother sleeping in a barn, confused and frightened, broke something inside me that I didn't know could break any further. This was my family, the people Mama had made me promise to protect, and I was powerless to help them. "What about Daddy?" I asked, though I almost didn't want to know. Patricia's voice cracked. "He's gotten worse since we lost the house. Yesterday I found him passed out behind Miller's Tavern at 10 in the morning. People are talking, Ellie. They're saying things about our family that I can't repeat." After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table and wept, not just for my family's situation, but for my own helplessness. Here I was, living in a comfortable house with a husband who had savings in the bank, and I couldn't lift a finger to help the people I loved most in the world. That evening, when Reggie came home from work, I was still red-eyed from crying. He noticed immediately, as he noticed everything these days. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, hanging his coat on the hook by the door. I told him about Patricia's call, about my family being homeless, about Michael sleeping in a barn. I didn't ask for money this time. I'd learned that lesson. I simply shared the pain that was eating me alive from the inside. Reggie listened without expression, then sat down at the table across from me. "Maybe this is what they need," he said with chilling matter-of-factness. "Maybe hitting rock bottom will force your father to face his problems." "They're children," I whispered. "Patricia and Michael are just children." "They're old enough to learn that actions have consequences," he replied. "Your father made his choices. Now his family is paying the price. That's how life works." The casual cruelty of his response left me speechless. This wasn't just indifference. It was active satisfaction at my family's suffering. He was enjoying my pain, using it as another tool to break me down completely. April brought spring to Tennessee, but no warmth to our house on Cedar Street. My missed monthly cycle confirmed what we both already knew. The inevitable had finally happened. I was pregnant. Reggie's reaction to the news was triumphant, almost euphoric. He swept me into his arms, spinning me around the kitchen like we were newlyweds again, his face glowing with satisfaction. "I knew it would happen once you stopped fighting it," he said, setting me down and placing his hands on my still flat stomach. "I knew you just needed the right motivation." The possessiveness in his touch, the ownership in his voice, made me feel sick. This child growing inside me wasn't conceived in love. It was the product of systematic coercion, the final victory in his campaign to control every aspect of my existence. "We need to see Dr. Harrison," I said, hoping that somehow my old ally might be able to help, even now. "No," Reggie said firmly. "We're switching to Dr. Morrison in the next county. Fresh start, no complications from past misunderstandings." Dr. Morrison was younger than Dr. Harrison, recently graduated from medical school and eager to build his practice. When we met him for the first time, he was deferential to Reggie in a way that made my heart sink. This man wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions or notice signs of trouble. He would see what Reggie wanted him to see. A happy young couple expecting their first child. "Congratulations," Dr. Morrison said, shaking Reggie's hand enthusiastically. "First babies are always exciting. We'll take excellent care of your wife. Your wife." Even my pregnancy belonged to Reggie in this man's eyes. I was just the vessel, the carrier of his precious cargo. Bajolo. The changes in my body began almost immediately. Morning sickness hit hard and lasted all day, leaving me weak and unable to keep food down. But instead of sympathy, Reggie's reaction was irritation when my vomiting interfered with his dinner schedule or when I was too exhausted to maintain the house to his standards. "Other women work in the fields right up until they give birth," he'd say when I asked to rest. "A little nausea never killed anyone." He hired Mrs. Fletcher, an older woman from town, to come in twice a week to help with the heavier cleaning. But her presence wasn't about helping me. It was about ensuring that his home remained perfect while I was indisposed. Mrs. Fletcher was a gossip who saw everything and reported it all back to the church ladies. Through her, the entire town would know exactly how I was managing my pregnancy, what I ate, how I looked, whether I was grateful enough for my husband's care. I became a specimen under a microscope, with Mrs. Fletcher as the primary observer. "Your husband is so devoted," she'd say while dusting the living room, "calling twice a day to check on you, making sure you have everything you need. You're lucky to have found such a caring man." If only she knew that those calls weren't about care, they were about surveillance. That his devotion felt more like suffocation with each passing day. The worst part of the pregnancy wasn't the physical discomfort, it was the complete loss of any hope for escape. Before, when it was just Ridgie and me, I could fantasize about leaving someday, about finding a way to break free. But now, with a child coming, I was trapped completely. Single mothers in 1953 had no options, no support, no way to survive independently. This baby would bind me to Ridgie Miller forever, exactly as he'd planned. In my darker moments, lying awake at night while he slept beside me, I wondered if this had been his strategy all along. Had he seen my mother's warnings, recognized her concern, and decided that the fastest way to secure me was through pregnancy? Had everything, the rushed courtship, the quick marriage, the isolation from my family, all been calculated moves in a game I didn't even know I was playing? Summer brought devastating news from town. Daddy had been found dead behind O'Malley's saloon, apparently from a combination of alcohol poisoning and exposure. He'd been there for 2 days before anyone bothered to check on the man who'd once been respected enough to work for the railroad. Patricia called with the news, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. "The funeral's Thursday," she managed to say. Can you come?" I looked at Ridgie, who had been listening to every word of the conversation from his chair at the kitchen table. His expression was impassive, giving no hint of what his answer might be. "Of course I'll be there," I said, though I had no idea if it was true. After I hung up, Ridgie was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and cold. "I suppose you'll want to go to this funeral." "He was my father," I said simply. "He was a drunk who destroyed his family and died in an alley like a vagrant," Ridgie replied. "But I understand that you feel obligated to pay your respects." Relief flooded through me. Despite everything, he was going to let me attend my own father's funeral. "However," he continued, and my heart sank, "in your condition, I don't think it's wise for you to expose yourself to all that emotion and stress. Dr. Morrison says pregnant women need to avoid situations that might upset them. Please," I begged, abandoning any pretense of pride. "I need to be there for Patricia and Michael. They have no one else now." "They have each other," he said dismissively, "and they have the charity of the church. You have more important responsibilities now, to the child you're carrying and to the family you've created with me." I attended my father's funeral from 3 miles away, sitting in my kitchen while my husband read his newspaper, morning sickness making me retch into a basin every few minutes. While my siblings buried the last of our parents, I was trapped in domestic hell, carrying the child of the man who had systematically destroyed my connection to everyone I'd ever loved. That night, I felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter so slight I almost missed it. Ridgie was beside himself with excitement when I told him, placing his hands on my stomach and talking to the child as if it could already understand his words. "That's my son," he said with absolute certainty. "My boy, letting us know he's healthy and strong." As I lay there with his hands possessing my body, feeling this new life moving inside me, I realized that I had become a complete prisoner. Not just of this house, not just of this marriage, but of my own body. The child I carried would be another tool for Ridgie to use against me, another chain to keep me bound to this life I never chose. But in that moment of complete despair, something unexpected happened. Feeling that tiny life inside me, a life that was half mine, whatever Ridgie believed, awakened something I thought he had killed completely. The fierce protectiveness that Mama had shown for her children began to stir in me. This baby, whatever the circumstances of its conception, would be part of me. And I would be damned if I'd let Reggie Miller destroy another generation of my family the way he'd helped destroy the last one. For the first time in months, I began to plan. Not for escape. That was impossible now, but for something much more dangerous. Survival with dignity, resistance from within, and the protection of the innocent life growing inside me. Reggie Miller thought he had won completely. He had no idea that he had just given me the most powerful motivation I'd ever had to fight back. The months that followed were a delicate dance between submission and secret rebellion. On the surface, I played the role Riggy demanded, the grateful pregnant wife, focused solely on carrying his child and maintaining his household. But underneath, something fundamental had shifted. The baby growing inside me had awakened a fierce maternal instinct that was stronger than my fear of him. I began documenting everything. Using scraps of paper hidden in old sewing patterns, I wrote down dates and details of his controlling behaviors, his threats, his physical aggression. I recorded the things he said about the baby, his plans for raising his son to take over the textile mill someday, his casual dismissal of my family's suffering. I didn't know what I would do with this information, but some instinct told me it might be important someday. The baby, a boy, as Reggie had predicted with such certainty, was born on a cold February morning in 1954. Labor was long and difficult, made worse by Dr. Morrison's inexperience, and Reggie's insistence on being present for everything, monitoring every decision, questioning every medical choice. When they placed little Thomas, named for Reggie's father without consulting me, in my arms, I felt a love so overwhelming it was like being struck by lightning. This tiny, perfect person was mine, regardless of how he'd been conceived or what his father intended for his future. In that moment, I made a silent promise that I would find a way to protect him from becoming another casualty of Reggie Miller's need for control. The first few months of motherhood were a blur of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. Reggie was initially delighted with his son, showing him off to anyone who would listen, talking endlessly about the boy's future and the family business. But his patience for the realities of infant care was limited. When Thomas cried at night, Reggie expected me to handle it without disturbing his sleep. When the baby needed feeding or changing during his dinner hour, I was expected to manage both simultaneously. "You wanted to be a mother," he'd say when I showed signs of exhaustion. "This is what mothers do." But it was during those long nights, walking the floor with a colicky baby while Reggie slept peacefully, that I began to formulate a real plan. Not for immediate escape. That was still impossible with a newborn and no resources, but for building a foundation that might someday support our freedom. I started small. When Mrs. Fletcher came to clean, I began asking her about her own family, her history in the area, people she knew. Gradually, I learned that she was a widow whose husband had left her a small inheritance. More importantly, she had strong opinions about women's rights and had quietly helped other women in difficult situations. "A woman should always have something of her own," she said one day while folding laundry. "Money, skills, something that doesn't depend on any man's goodwill." I tested the waters carefully. What if a woman wanted to learn a trade, hypothetically? Mrs. Fletcher's keen eyes studied my face. Hypothetically, she might start by taking in sewing work, build up a clientele, save a little money here and there. A woman with a reputation for fine needlework could always support herself, even if other circumstances changed. That conversation planted a seed. I began offering to mend clothes for Mrs. Fletcher's friends, claiming I needed something to occupy my hands while nursing the baby. The work was simple at first, hemming dresses, replacing buttons, basic alterations. But word spread, and soon I had a steady stream of small jobs. Reggie was initially pleased that I'd found a suitable hobby that kept me occupied at home. I was careful to present it as something I did for the satisfaction of helping others, never mentioning the small payments I received. The money, nickels and dimes at first, then quarters and occasional dollar bills, went into a mason jar hidden inside an old flour sack in the pantry. By Thomas's first birthday, I had saved nearly $50 and established a reputation as the best seamstress in 3 counties. More importantly, I had created a network of women who knew my work, trusted my skills, and might someday provide references if I needed to support myself independently. The crisis that changed everything came just after Thomas turned 2. Patricia, now 19 and working as a waitress in town, came to visit on a Sunday afternoon when Reggie was at his lodge meeting. She'd been staying with various church families since Daddy's death, working wherever she could find employment, trying to save money for a place of her own. "I have news," she said, her face glowing with a happiness I hadn't seen since before Mama died. "Bobby Morrison asked me to marry him." Bobby Morrison, the same boy who tried to offer condolences at Mama's funeral, who'd been turned away from our wedding reception by Reggie's cold possessiveness. He'd grown into a decent man with a steady job at the bank, and I could see why Patricia had fallen for his gentle nature. "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it completely. "When's the wedding?" "That's the thing," Patricia said, her smile faltering slightly. "Bobby wants to do it right. He wants to ask Daddy's permission, but since Daddy's gone..." She took a breath. "He wants to ask Reggie, as the head of the family now." My stomach dropped. I could already imagine Reggie's reaction to being asked to give permission for my sister to marry the man he'd once seen as competition for my attention. "Maybe that's not necessary," I suggested carefully. "You're 19, old enough to make your own decisions." "Bobby's old-fashioned," Patricia explained. "He says it's the respectful thing to do, and I want to start our marriage with everyone's blessing." When Reggie returned from his meeting that evening, I told him about Patricia's visit and Bobby's request. His reaction was immediate and predictable. "Absolutely not," he said, his face darkening with anger. "I won't give my permission for your sister to marry that interfering little banker." "Why not?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Bobby's a good man with steady work. He'll take care of Patricia." "Because," Reggie said, his voice taking on that dangerous calm I'd learned to fear, "your sister has proven she can't make good decisions. Look at how she handled your father's drinking, how she let the family fall apart. She needs guidance, not independence." But I could see the real reason in his eyes. Bobby Morrison represented everything Reggie despised. A man who might encourage Patricia to maintain a relationship with me, who might question why I was so isolated from my family, who might notice things that were better left unobserved. "She's my sister," I said quietly. "The only family I have left." "I'm your family now," Reggie replied. "Our son is your family. That's all you need to concern yourself with." The conversation might have ended there, as so many others had, with my quiet submission to his will. But something in his casual dismissal of Patricia's happiness, his easy destruction of her chance at love, triggered something in me that I'd kept buried for too long. "I'm going to the engagement party," I announced, surprising myself with my decisiveness, "whether you approve or not." Reggie's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, and then something calculating that I recognized with growing dread. "No," he said simply. "You're not." "She's my sister," I repeated, standing up from the kitchen table where we'd been having this conversation. "I've already missed too much of her life because of your rules. I won't miss this." What happened next unfolded with terrible inevitability. Reggie stood up as well, his face flushed with rage, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment we faced each other across the kitchen table like opponents in some ancient battle. "You seem to have forgotten your place," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more frightening than any shout. "Let me remind you." He moved around the table with deliberate slowness, and I backed away instinctively, my heart racing with familiar fear. But this time was different. This time I wasn't just protecting myself. I was protecting my son's future, my sister's happiness, the memory of my mother's warnings. When Reggie raised his hand to strike me, I was ready. The cast-iron skillet was within reach on the counter, and I grabbed it without thinking, swinging it toward him with all the strength that years of suppressed rage could provide. The sound it made connecting with his skull was sickeningly final. Reggie dropped like a stone, blood pooling beneath his head on the kitchen floor that I'd scrubbed clean that very morning. For several long minutes, I stood frozen, the skillet still in my hands, staring at the man who had controlled every aspect of my life for 3 years. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. He was simply gone. The practical part of my mind took over then. I checked on Thomas, still napping peacefully in his crib, unaware that his world had just changed forever. I called the sheriff's office, my voice steady as I reported that there had been an accident, that my husband had fallen and hit his head. When Sheriff Bradley arrived with Dr. Harrison, dear Dr. Harrison, who took one look at the scene and understood immediately what had really happened, I told them the truth. How Reggie had been controlling and abusive, how he'd isolated me from my family, how he'd finally pushed me too far when he tried to destroy Patricia's chance at happiness. It was self-defense, Dr. Harrison said firmly, examining the body and taking note of the fresh bruises on my arms. Clear case of a woman protecting herself from an abusive husband. The trial was brief. Too many people in town had noticed my isolation, Reggie's possessive behavior, the way he'd controlled every aspect of my life. Mrs. Fletcher testified about the things she'd witnessed. Dr. Harrison spoke about the birth control incident and his concerns about my marriage. Even Patricia, brave Patricia, stood up in court and described how Reggie had systematically cut me off from my family. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty by reason of self-defense. Now, 70 years later, sitting in my small apartment in Nashville with my great-grandchildren playing at my feet, I can finally tell this story without shame. I raised Thomas as a single mother, building my sewing business into a successful shop that supported us both. Patricia married her Bobby and had 4 beautiful children who called me Aunt Ellie and never knew about the darkness I'd escaped. Thomas grew up to be nothing like his father, gentle, kind, respectful of women, everything Reggie had planned to beat out of him. He became a teacher instead of a factory worker, married a strong woman who was his equal partner, and raised children who understand that love is about respect, not control. I never remarried. After Reggie, I treasured my independence too much to ever risk it again. But I had love, the love of my son, my sister's family, the women I employed in my shop, the community I'd built through my own strength and determination. The most important lesson I learned is this: it's never too late to fight back. Even when you think you're trapped completely, even when escape seems impossible, there's always a moment when you can choose to save yourself and those you love. Sometimes survival requires violence. Sometimes protecting the innocent means destroying the destroyer. I've never regretted the choice I made that day in my kitchen because it saved not just my life, but my son's future and my sister's happiness. If you're listening to this and recognizing your own situation in my story, please know that you're stronger than you think. Help exists, even when it doesn't seem like it. And sometimes, when all else fails, you have to save yourself. Idiklas, fidi, the bruises fade, my dears. The fear eventually passes. But freedom, once you've fought for it and won it, that lasts forever. Thank you for listening to my story. May it give you courage if you need it, and peace if you found your own way to freedom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.